Welcome, everybody. I'm Barbara Groeschel with the Center for Dispute Resolution at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, better known as CDRM. I'm the director of the School Conflict Resolution Education Program. I've had the privilege to work together with many of you and your districts over the past 16 years. I'm truly looking forward to our conversation today with Joe Brummer, entitled An Introduction to Trauma-Informed Restorative Practices. The connection between trauma and building a restorative school climate and culture is so critical, especially in today's ever-changing and challenging world. I also do want to take a moment to acknowledge the Crane Family Foundation, whose generous grant has allowed us to host this three-part fall series with no fee. Before we begin, I want to review a few connection tips with logistical details about the webinar. For this event, please feel free to disable your camera, as using an active camera uses a lot of bandwidth and we do have a large audience. Please make sure to remain muted. If you find yourself having bandwidth challenges, try closing all your other programs and your browser. Try exiting or re-entering if you experience a lag. This often works. In the meantime, consider calling in, and you should find the phone number included in the invitation email while you navigate any tech challenges. And if you find, in fact, you need some advice on those tech challenges, feel free to email Arthur Cook. He works with us at the law school, and his email address is acook, C-O-O-K, @law.umaryland.edu. Feel free to use the chat feature to express questions as they arise for you, or toward the end, you may raise your hand. Our facilitation team will gather these and will convey as many as possible to Joe toward the end of our time together. This event is being recorded, and we will be forwarding a link to the event afterwards. Shortly after today's webinar, please watch for a brief evaluation form that will be sent out today. Your input is greatly appreciated. And now it's truly my pleasure to introduce Joe Brummer. Joe is a national leader and expert in the field of trauma-informed restorative practices, among his many areas of expertise. Joe and I first met in 2017 when I traveled to Boston to attend a small educator training he was conducting through the Suffolk University Center for Dispute Resolution. I was struck by his deep experience and heart for this work at a time when the Maryland Commission on the School to Prison Pipeline and Restorative Practices was just ramping up to begin its work. I learned so much in the two-day workshop. As you know from reading his brief bio, Joe has worked as an independent consultant for schools and school districts, supporting the development of trauma-informed approaches to restorative practices across the United States. Joe cares deeply about children and adults in communities. His book, Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School, Skills and Approaches for Improving Culture and Behavior, is scheduled for release in December at the end of this year. And just one additional thought. The topic of trauma requires considerable thought, reflection, and effort to address in a meaningful way. For many of you, I know this topic is not new. But if you find this topic is new for you or your staff, you're strongly encouraged to seek additional training and support in order to build safe and welcoming communities for all students and adults who may be touched by trauma. Joe, welcome aboard, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. So I'm going to do the old pop up a PowerPoint, which help us sort of guide this conversation. It's really more about me than it is you having a PowerPoint. And so I guess we'll just kind of dive in. So for the past 5 years, I've been working as an independent consultant, working with schools and working with districts all over the country on rolling out restorative practices, but done through a trauma-informed lens. And making a quick note that when I talk about trauma-informed, I'm including racial trauma in that conversation, because I think the way that we're currently framing it doesn't always capture just the harm that continuously happens as racial traumas continue to happen. and are continuing to happen. And so when we talk about trauma, know that that element needs to be part of that conversation. And so restorative practices on their own are not trauma informed. On the flip side of that, trauma-informed practices are inherently restorative, which is a kind of weird thinking. But to really take our restorative practices to the next level is to start seeing those practices, including, circle practice, restorative chats, the use of the restorative questions, respect agreements. When we use those things, we need to be doing that through a trauma-informed lens. And we'll sort of talk about what that means today. But to start off, let's just do some basics. What is trauma-informed? What is restorative justice? And what does that look like in a school? And so your starting point really is, what is trauma? And so clear up a few myths about trauma. Trauma is actually not the events and things that happen to us. It's actually our body's response to those events. And so it's not the events that we go through. Two people can go through the same event, and only one of them will come out experiencing symptoms of traumatic impacts, depression, anxiety, flashbacks, PTSD. So it's not really these events. It's how our bodies hold them and react to them. It lives in our central nervous system all the way down to a cellular level, that your whole body responds to a threat. And the interesting thing about humans is that there's really no distinction between a physical threat and an emotional threat. Our bodies respond the same. And so in thinking about that, we have different types of trauma, we have different experiences of trauma. But when we really want to put this into a school, we also, we need to think about the fact that our students are experiencing trauma. It may be acute trauma, it may be complex trauma, it may be layers of trauma. And then add to that, I'll throw this in, that I used to get the question in every training, Joe, how will we know which kids have trauma and which kids don't? And the answer at this point, all of them, just all of them. The current circumstances that we are all in with the coronavirus, the pandemic, racial tensions that are covering our news, a political campaign that's probably a little more savory than usual, for lack of a better way of saying that, those can become in their own right collective trauma that we are all experiencing. And when you think about how this is impacting people, we know from history that literally these kind of events can change people's DNA and how it shows up. So epigenetics, like the historical trauma. And so when we look at collective trauma, we're also talking, historical trauma. COVID-19 and this pandemic and these current circumstances we're under are part of collective trauma. So you think of things like 9/11, the Holocaust, slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, mass incarceration, these huge events where entire populations of people are going through a trauma together are considered collective trauma. And so that question now, which kids have been exposed to trauma and which kids haven't, the answer is just everybody. Everyone around you has been exposed to trauma right now. And you may actually be experiencing it for yourself. Your sleeping patterns might be off, your food patterns might be off, your moods might go up and down. You might be really happy in the morning and then really bummed out in the afternoon and then happy again by evening. This is, your body is trying to process incredible things going on around you. And for our children, they have about half the skills that we do as adults to handle that. And so, knowing that's kind of where we are, let's talk about what trauma looks like for kids. And so when we talk about a trauma-informed school, it's the realization that our kids are going through some tough stuff. And any teacher could make this list bigger for me. But some possible traumatic events that kids can go through are things like separation from a parent, which if you think about that during COVID, it may be that their parents are healthcare workers. I actually have some really close friends. One, they're both nurse practitioners in an ICU helping COVID patients. They're also raising 3 children. And so right now they quarantine themselves from their kids. Those things have impact on children. You could have a disruptive home life, homelessness, which in schools, for kids, especially high school kids, homelessness doesn't look like what you think it looks like. It can really be couch hopping, living in a hotel, staying with relatives, living in your car. Then there's childhood illness, but both for the child that is ill, but also for siblings when there's childhood illness present. There's, the normal culprits of divorce, bullying, foster care, and add in there things you don't think about, like fetal alcohol syndrome, premature birth. I don't think people realize all the time that when a child is born prematurely, we go through absolutely heroic measures to keep them alive. But those heroic measures are also at a very, very early stage, introducing them to pain, introducing them to suffering, because they're getting probed with needles. They're not being picked up and held because they need to be incubated. So premature birth can have, very impactful, things attached to it. And oftentimes when we talk about children and trauma, there's this misconception that, as long as they're too young to remember it, well, then it didn't happen. But the reality is their bodies remember it. And so there is a point where our sort of implicit and explicit memory are still memory. And so even though a child is prematurely born and has no explicit memory, the ability to recall those things, the body is still holding the memories of what happens to it. And it does that as self-protection, so that should those things come up again, that the body knows how to respond. And so add into this list, again, homophobia, racism, sexism, classism. These are all forms of trauma. And they have an incredible impact on our nervous systems. Trauma has an interesting impact on the brain, and which is why it has an interesting impact on learning and behavior in a school. And so this list is really adapted from Jim Sporleader and Heather Forbes' book, The Trauma-Informed School, an Administrator's Handbook. And so if you have a brain, which I think this is funny when we talk about a brain not exposed to trauma, because I haven't really met one of those yet. But when you think about a brain that has not been exposed to trauma as a child, you're talking about a brain that has the ability for kindness and compassion. They have room in their body for that. You're talking about a kid who actually cognitively is able to do theory of mind, cognitive empathy, because they have access to their frontal cortex. They have the ability to be imaginative and curious about learning. They can think logically through thoughts because they've got access to this higher order thinking, rational thinking. They also just feel safe. And so because they feel safe, their nervous system leaves them in a place where they can play, they can learn. And interestingly enough, some things you don't think about. One, kids whose brains have not been exposed to trauma, whose fight or flight systems are not engaged, have the ability to think through time. Human beings are one of the few animals on the planet that have the ability to think in time. That is because we have a frontal cortex. It allows us to have a sense of the past and the future and the present. Kids that have been exposed to trauma don't have that because it's a frontal cortex thing in order for you to process time. And so many kids that have been exposed to trauma don't really have an idea of later. And so when we say, well, if you do X, we'll give you Y at the end, they're like, nah, you'll give it to me now, because they don't have that concept of time. At the end of the day, a kid that has never been exposed to trauma is going to have a fairly normal brain. So if you think of this as a brain, this is your brainstem. It controls things like breathing and blinking your eyes and beating your heart. This is your limbic system, primarily your amygdala. And folded over that, pretty much where my fingernails are, this would be your frontal cortex. This is the higher order rational thinking part of your brain. It does things like process language, sequential order thinking, cognitive flexibility, self-regulation. It also does learning and language. When kids have been exposed to trauma, They think from the bottom up. In other words, they're bottom up. The bottom of their brain is controlling their thinking. Kids that have never been exposed to trauma think from their top down. They're thinking from their frontal cortex, and that's what's controlling the emotional show. And so one of the things that we know is that kids that have been exposed to trauma can't do sequential order thinking. They can't do higher order executive function stuff, or they're limited in what they can do. And the more their brain is engaged in that fight or flight syndrome, the less access they have to that higher order thinking. And so how's that show up in a classroom? In a classroom, trauma can show up in a number of ways that look like what they are, and then some that don't. And so when we think about our fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn, responses, fight looks like fight until it doesn't. And so one of the things that our bodies do when we're in a fight or flight mode is you get a big boost of serotonin and dopamine that are meant to sort of lift your mood so you'll care about the threat. But for a 10-year-old boy discussing an uncomfortable subject, that usually shows up as giggles and nervous laughter. And so oftentimes we think a child is not taking it seriously when actually they're giggling because they are taking it seriously. And so we need to be in tune to what's the emotional state of this child, and is that laughter humor, or is that laughter a nervous response? And so other things you might see are, talking back, stuff you'd expect, talking back, refusal to sit down, getting into an argument with the adult. And then let's look at, let's say, fight. Fight behavior, again, it looks like flight, where, we're walking out of class, we're cutting class, we're avoiding a teacher, we're leaving school and cutting, not showing up to school in the first place. All could be forms of flight behavior. But then there are some smaller ones, like, I don't know how many of you are familiar, especially if you're educators, with what we refer to as hovering. That hovering nervous child that seems to be like attached at your hip, and they're talking a mile a minute, and it seems like they're making up reasons to be around an adult. Mrs. Smith, are we having a test today? I was wondering if we're gonna have a test today because I really studied hard today. What are you gonna be doing later, Mrs. Smith? And they're just making this reasoning up to talk to you. And really that's nervous flight behavior. That is a child who's not running, he's not running away from you, but he's running to you away from something else. And so we have to think, like, what is there with that? Is this child like avoiding a bully? Is this child avoiding a fight? Is this child avoiding go to another class where he's afraid a teacher is mad at him? Again, generally when we see that hovering behavior, teachers keep doing what they're doing. And they're like, good God, what's wrong? Why is this kid doing this? And the reality is we should stop what we're doing and co-regulate that nervous system, because clearly they're in distress. Other one that's up here on the list that I always want to point out is sort of headphones and earbuds, especially with our teenagers. There's no music playing. About half the kids you see walking through the hallways with earbuds are doing what autistic kids have been doing for years, which is noise canceling headphones or headphones to just block out sensory input. Trauma impacts the brain in ways that can cause sensory disorders. And very oftentimes there's so much noise in the hallways, so much noise in the cafeteria, the kids are putting in the headphones. But of course there are usually policies that say no headphones, no earbuds. And so when teachers go through the hallway, they're constantly like, headphones, earbuds, take those out. When the reality is we should be checking in with those kids first. Hey, I see you have your headphones in. Is everything okay? Like we want to regulate their nervous system before we jump on their behavior. That whole idea of connect before you correct. Then we have what we would call freeze. Freeze behavior is the sort of last resort before the body shuts down and does faint. And it can go as far as children hiding under desks. It could be kids who just sort of, they stare at you with these blank glassy eyes and you're like, it doesn't even look like they're in there. And it could be because they're not, because they just checked out as a self-protection against what their body is perceiving as a threat. At its worst, and maybe in smaller children, Children can become so scared that they lose the ability to recognize people's faces. Even a teacher they know really well, they will be like, who are you? And it's because they're scared. Our last one on this list is fawn, which is not greatly talked about part of our nervous reactions. It primarily happens to women, although I would make the argument that I think it also happens to gay men. Because our brains are more similar to a female brain, I believe gay men also experience a form of fawn. Fawn is when children befriend their threat. And rather than being based in adrenaline and serotonin, it's actually based in oxytocin, a neurochemical that primarily helps us with trust and bonding. It also helps women go into labor and helps with pregnancy. Oxytocin is a stress hormone that helps regulate all sorts of our stress system. In women, there is a much higher number of how much oxytocin is in their systems. And because they have higher amounts of it, they get basically superpowers to deal with the threat, which is befriended. It usually looks like a lack of boundaries, exaggerated people pleasing, which is, that student that constantly wants to help out or wants to become friends with the kids that are fighting with them or are bullying them, in hopes that if I befriend this threat, it won't hurt me. Probably the most famous case of that I've ever heard about was years and years ago. This man went into an Atlanta courtroom and he shot up the courtroom and killed several people. He then went out into the Atlanta suburbs and broke into a woman's home and held her hostage, except she didn't really have a hostage mindset. She went into fawn. She befriended him, she connected with him, she was able to talk him into turning himself in. That is part of this whole fawn response. And this, by the way, there's a message at the bottom of where I created this list from. It comes from a couple different sources of lists like this I'd seen before and combined. And so, hey, I don't want to do that yet. So I'm going to show you all a quick, is fawn related to Stockholm Syndrome? I would say yes, probably. It's probably based in the same ideas. I think Stockholm Syndrome is probably slightly more complicated. But yeah, I bet there's probably definitely some correlation between those two. So I'm going to show you all a quick video. I just got to make it so you can hear. And then I'm going to sort of check in. This video comes from the movie Resilience, and it really describes to you what is going on in a child's brain when they're in fight or flight. And so I'm just going to let you watch this and then we'll go through it.
The reality is that we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of anxiety to perform well. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming at us, we have release of adrenaline. We have release of a hormone that we call cortisol. We want to jump out of there, and adrenaline and cortisol are going to help us do that. So there's that good amount of stress. But if all day long you're feeling like a truck is coming at you, day after day after day, that's going to take a toll on the body. And the amygdala obviously here has greater activation.
Yes.
In the PTSD. We were able to image children that had experienced trauma and compare those brain images with children that didn't have an experience of trauma, didn't have symptoms.
Right, an exaggerated fear response.
An exaggerated fear response with decreased activation in areas that we need to control that emotion, in the frontal areas.
Exposure to early adversity and trauma literally affects the structure and function of children's developing brains. So the kid next to them hits them, or the teacher reprimands them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, right? Literally what they're feeling, that activation is like there was a truck coming at them. You can give something that will mask symptoms, right? For example, if someone has a cough, right? You can give them a really strong cough serum that will suppress their cough. But if it's because they have tuberculosis or lung cancer, then what you're doing is merely masking the symptoms while the disease process continues to fester. We know what's happening in children's brains and bodies with the experience of toxic stress. So the question now is, what do we do about it?
Muted. I think that's the 2020 phrase of the year. Oops, I'm on mute. So what does trauma-informed mean? And when we say, you know, we're going to be trauma-informed, what is that? What is that? And so trauma-informed is really a way of thinking and being. It's not what you do, it's how you show up. And it's the lens in which we see children's behavior, which unfortunately, because we live in such a punitive society, we see discipline and behavior as something to control through the use of punishments and rewards and external stuff, which we'll get to why that is so problematic in a minute. But because we have that lens on, we're constantly looking for something to reward or punish, which means we see behavior as misbehavior, off task, disruptive, bad. When we need to start seeing them, instead of in trouble, we need to start seeing kids in struggle, because that's more accurate. More accurately, what kids are going through is they have a problem and they lack the skills to solve that problem. And because they lack the skills to solve that problem, they also lack the ability to sort of manage the emotions that come with it and then tell us about it. And so they use their behavior as a way of telling us what's going on with them. And so we need to move away from seeing the behavior as bad or disruptive and start seeing it as a dysregulated nervous system. And that may not be from trauma. That may be just, sometimes our nervous systems misfire. They call it faulty neuroception. That comes from Mona Delahook. And so we need to start thinking of them as stressed out, coping. Many of the behaviors we see in children are adaptive. And at home, these behaviors might be keeping them alive, but in math class, they're kind of problematic. And so we need to change the lens at which we see those things. Trauma-informed also means moving away from reminding them of the directions over and over and over again, and start instead asking the questions of why they're struggling. In other words, collaboratively problem solve with them. It means moving away from, here's what I want and you're gonna do it, to, seems like you're having a little bit of a struggle there. How do I redirect you? And at the end of the day, trauma-informed is about not focusing on what's wrong with people and instead focusing on what happened to them. Because it's so much more accurate to, I mean, that's what we do. We're like, what's wrong with you? ADHD, ADD, ODD, we have an initial for everything, alphabet soup. Or we could look at it and say, what's your history? So once we have trauma-informed sort of covered, then we also need to make this move towards restorative and what that means. And so restorative is one, not a new alternative discipline system. And so when people talk about restorative justice in schools, it is not an alternative to discipline. And in fact, it's an alternative to community building. It is an alternative way of focusing your school on relationships and focusing your school on community. That is what restorative justice is truly about. Unfortunately, the education world has sort of co-opted restorative practices in schools to be this alternative discipline program or an alternative to suspensions, when the reality is it should really be used to prevent those things, not respond to them. And the biggest reason for that is because punishment in kids punishments and rewards in general don't work well for kids who have been exposed to trauma. In fact, I would argue that punishments don't do anything for anyone that's positive. There's nothing positive about punishment. Why we are still such a punitive-minded little creatures, I have no idea. Because literally, we've been researching this for years, and all of the research on punishment is pretty much negative. punishment in of itself. And so just looking at the research and what does the research say about punishment? One, it's focused on the past. It's not going to change anything. So you're focusing on people's past perceived wrongdoings. Well, there's a problem there with the word perceived. One person's wrong is somebody else's right. And one person's freedom fighter is somebody else's terrorist. Borrowing that language from Marshall Rosenberg. We just don't see everything eye to eye. And so when we start making punishment about perceived wrongdoing, it's starting to get arbitrary. And then who gets to decide what's wrong and what's right? Because in some cultures, in some families, respect looks like one thing, and in others, respect looks like another thing. So who gets to determine whose respect is wrong and whose is right? That's problematic, and it causes problems. Punishment, I can't believe we had research to do this, but we actually did research to show us that punishment teaches kids to lie. You could have just asked me when I was like 4, and my mom said, "Did you eat those cookies?" And I'm like, "No." And why? That's the funny thing about punishment is it thwarts accountability. If you truly want children to own and be accountable for their mistakes, well, then you've got to stop making them suffer for having a mistake. Because as long as suffering is on the table, who's going to tell you the truth? It's almost obvious that it would make kids lie. And then we always ask, why are you lying to me? It's like, because of what you'll do to me. This is right off the research. Rarely results in positive changes in behavior, may increase subversiveness, or result in temporary suppression of behavior. At best, it produces compliance. Compliance and obedience are not discipline. There's no ethics, there's no morals there. It's best punishing children, one, just has them focusing on the suffering they're going through. So when you punish them, they're going to focus on what you're doing to them. They are not going to focus on what they did to get there. And so they're not thinking through mistakes and thinking about how to make things right. They're thinking through what you're doing to them because they made a mistake, and they will make themselves the victim. And for many of our kids, that's this failure identity. The same kids that we see getting punished in kindergarten are the same kids I see getting punished in 1st and 2nd grade, are the same kids that we see getting punished in middle school, and the same ones we see suspended or expelled by high school. They're the same kids. And so each time we keep punishing them, we keep giving them the identity that they're a kid that needs to be punished. And so they live up to what we tell them they are. Punishment teaches what you don't want. It doesn't teach what you do want. So if I get punished for hitting my sister, I know not to hit my sister, but I still don't know what to do when I'm upset or angry with her. Punishment doesn't teach that. Punishment sends a message that when you aren't doing your best, people will hurt you more. Children, when they mess up, are usually already feeling embarrassed and suffering. And then on top of that, we have to add suffering. I'm sorry, when your goal is to make someone suffer, that's violence. I equate punishment with violence, and I know not everybody's ready to make that leap, but I don't know how I couldn't make that leap. The end game of a punishment is to add suffering. I don't know why anyone would do that. I have no use for adding suffering in the world. I just don't. And my last one, I don't know why adults can't see this, but punishment teaches that threats of harm, taking valued things away, are all valid ways of getting your way. It's bullying. You're just teaching kids how to be bullies by modeling bullying. I know lots of people are probably like, this is right from the research. This is what punishment does. So we need a new way of creating spaces where kids can learn. Spaces that are mindful of the traumas they've experienced, but also mindful of the fact they're still learning their skills. And that when kids mess up, it's probably a skill thing, not an I didn't try hard enough. And so our conventional thinking requires punishments and rewards because we think behavior is external and that kids are just not trying hard. It's motivational. Punishments and rewards are meant, and this is exactly how they work. Punishments and rewards motivate children to use skills they already have. Generally, when we see misbehavior, it's because kids are lacking skills, cognitive flexibility, sequential order thinking, language processing, self-regulation. It's not that they're not motivated. And so our current way of working with kids is to quote unquote motivate them to behave on the assumption that they're simply not trying hard enough. And so every time that little Johnny, talks out in class, he simply isn't trying hard enough to be quiet. That's ludicrous. What he hasn't done is develop enough of a control system in his brain to help him not do that stuff. And so if we see it as he's not trying hard enough, then we're going to try to make him try harder by punishments and rewards. By the way, that's never going to teach him the skills he needs. And so if we see that as a lagging skill, then we're probably going to come back and try and teach that skill. Mindfulness, other ways of teaching children to not talk out in class. But punishment is never going to teach that kid that skill. The only way any of this can happen is if we create a trauma-informed restorative school. And so let's explain what that means. This is a school where kids feel safe, where they feel valued, where every educator feels valued. Because a trauma-informed school has also got to be a trauma-informed workplace. And so we bring restorative justice into a school for two purposes. On the front end of this is community building, relationship-based school. Imagine that your school has a relational ecology. Now, if that relational ecology is toxic, then it's probably feeding itself to stay toxic. Teachers don't get along with admin. Admin doesn't trust their teachers. There's issues between this. And by the way, when staff in a school don't get along, that will be reflected in the behavior of students. So your discipline data on suspensions and it is directly affected by how well staff get along. I don't know if y'all knew that or not. So on the front end, we're going to use restorative circles. We're going to use respect agreements. We're going to use community building stuff to create a safe community that's based in relationships that recognizes the interconnectedness of us all. On the back end of that, things are going to go wrong. Kids are going to hurt each other. Kids get into fights. They're kids. And we've come to a point where we've criminalized so much of their behavior. It's just frankly normal developmental stuff. And so we need the back end of this, which says, instead of asking what rule did you break, who broke it, and how do I punish you for breaking it, we say, well, what's the harm? Who's been harmed? How do we repair that harm? And so, by the way, if you're going to go in it, you need the whole car. So you need the front end, the community building, but you also need the maintenance and repair when relationships are broken. So we're going to build relationships, and then we're going to maintain those relationships. But it's all about the relationships, which means we don't send kids away. We bring them in close. Because when they're acting in ways that don't work for us, sending them away to go wallow in that is not going to create the relationship and connection to school that they need. So we don't send them away. We pull them in close. We get them more connected, not less. And I'm gonna skip this and come back to it if I use it at all. And so here's probably the slide that I'll stick with for a second, is that our punitive systems have kids feeling like things are done to them. If we give them too many expectations, but no support in getting to them, if kids feel like they're having stuff done to them, which is punishments, it's how they learn, and we'll do it to you. If we have no expectations and just all support for them, this is basically what I would call helicopter parents that will leave work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to go home, grab their kid's homework assignment, and then drive it to school so he can have it. Rather than just letting him learn from his consequences. That you forget your homework, you don't get a grade for it. Unfortunately, we're doing so much for kids that we disempower them to do things for themselves. We want to live in this box of with, where we're doing things with kids. We have very high expectations of them, but we also have the support to help them meet those expectations. At any given time, educators live all over these boxes. There are times where you have to we're in the 2 box. It's not our fault. Sometimes we are in the 4 box. What we really want to spend our time and our thinking learning how to be in that with box. So always doing our work from the with box. And what that really means is everything's honoring choice, autonomy, connection, relationship. And that means giving up a little bit of control and voice and giving it back to students. And I know that's terrifying for a lot of educators, because they're like, oh my God, what if my class gets out of hand? It won't. It'll be okay. And so, move this little box. So I know there's probably lots of chat going on in the chat that I've not been looking at. Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah. Feel free to post questions in the chat, because otherwise I just talk and don't know what you all really want to know. So here's how this works. When I go into a school, right now we have a lot of cookie cutter restorative practices going on. One size fits all, train and pray models. Organizations or trainers come in, they train everybody in restorative practices and running circles, and they think that's what's going to work. It's not going to work. And I'll tell you why. Those things lack infrastructure that will actually help these changes stick around for a while. And so when I start doing implementation of this work, we're talking about these 6 boxes. We're doing this through a lens of equity. Can I show the last? I don't know if I can or not. Let me see. This one? Yes. And I'll happily give people this slideshow if you want it. Like, I'm super happy to share this with you. So don't feel like you have to screen. I'll happily send this to you. And so these are the 6 boxes that we work on. So what I'm doing is a combined implementation of equity work, restorative justice, trauma-informed, nonviolent communication, mindfulness, and Ross Green's work around collaborative and proactive solutions. I think when you take these 6 boxes and make them a joint implementation, the work gets easier, but it also allows you to have an infrastructure that supports the change and makes it sustainable. If you just train everybody and hope it works, there's no sustainability in that. We want to set up a structure that sustains this kind of thinking, so that if we lose half our teachers, we don't lose this way of thinking in our school, the culture that we're creating. And so in order to do these 6 things, identified 5 skills that I believe are crucial to the work. And so there are 5 skills that every educator needs to be restorative. And those are empathy, honest expression, questions to be able to problem solve. Like, we really need to be able to ask the right questions. We need to do the art of request, which is when kids do make mistakes or cause harm, how will that be repaired in a strength-based, age-appropriate, and really restorative way, so that we really are doing things that help repair harm rather than seek out punishments. And then lastly, mindfulness in this work for me is both a skill and a practice. So we get the skill of what mindfulness is, and then we start putting it in practice throughout our school. The way that I've been sort of, pulling this off is that we concentrate on some specific restorative practices. There are dozens of practices in schools right now that I think are incredibly restorative. Here's the ones that we focus on. Bringing in mindfulness as a whole school practice. Bringing in restorative language as a whole school practice, which for me is bringing in Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, to really make sure that we're speaking in ways that are supportive, that are non-judgmental, that are almost nonviolent language. We add that to using what I call respect agreements. These are an idea that came from Ron and Roxanne Klassen in their book, Discipline That Restores. I just took it a step further than they did, in that these agreements can't be us just going to a classroom full of kids and saying, how do y'all want to respect each other? Because kids are people pleasers. They will just tell you what you want, what they think you want to hear. They're trying to give you the right answer, but they're not giving you an answer they care about. So later on, this respect agreement's up there and you're like, well, y'all signed your names to it. The reality is they don't really care about that respect agreement because they just told you what you wanted to hear. The way out of that, ask them stories. Ask them to tell their stories about being respected, about being disrespected, and then pull from those stories meaningful agreements that could help us all share time with each other. We do use collaborative and proactive solutions, formerly collaborative problem solving. This is the work of Ross Green and his organization Lives in the Balance. We do advocate for proactive circles, so community building circles at least once a week, although I'd like to see them happening in a school more often than that. You can't have restorative circles unless you've been doing community building circles. You can't, because the relationships you need to have a restorative circle aren't there. And so we need to build those relationships using community building circles, and then restorative circles and conferencing to address misbehaviors only when we've built some relationship to do that. We need to bring students' involvement into this, so it's really important that we have students involved in this work. Even as far as training them to be circle keepers, training them to be peer mediators, training them to be restorative justice trainers. I've seen some of the best restorative justice training I've ever attended was led by youth. And so I'm a huge fan of youth involvement. We have a couple different really cool projects here with youth and in high school students who are they're not just running, they're leading the restorative justice stuff in their schools. We also advocate for de-escalation spaces or calm corners, places students can go when they're in distress to get their bodies regulated, and teaching them how to use those things. We want to rely on our community partnerships with mental health and food pantries to make sure kids have access to basic needs. You can't be a trauma-informed school when your kids are starving. And then, of course, formal conferencing when the really big stuff happens. And I actually advocate that schools call in a restorative justice person or have somebody on staff who's really been trained in formal conferencing. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there training people in conferencing who've never done it, who've literally never run a restorative conference in their life, but are out training other people to do it. And I personally think that that's hugely irresponsible. So respect agreements, I'll skip that one. Proactive circles. Let's just jump really quickly before we jump to Q&A. The place that I think a lot of the trainers are not spending any time is on implementation work. We're not looking at implementation science to do this work. And so schools spend enormous amounts of money having organizations come in and train them, teach them how to run circles, and then they never do the policy work to actually make that stuff stick around. And so it falls apart in a couple of years. I think the way that we get out of that is to make sure that we have this top-down, bottom-up, side-to-side approach to the work, which means at the top end of this, we need our Board of Ed, our leadership, you cannot do this without admin support in the building. If your principal doesn't support this in the building, it's not gonna happen. So we need that work done. We also need somebody to look at our policies, our code of conduct, and make sure that they are not sexist, racist, or quite frankly, punishing kids for things like addiction, which oftentimes that's the first go-to when kids are found with drugs, is we want to punish them rather than get them counseling and the social worker approach, as I sometimes call it. On the bottom end of this, we need this work to be like lateral. I really don't like coming into schools and doing all the training work. I would rather come in and train teacher leaders to go do that work. And then I'll be there to support it, but I really want this to be teacher to teacher, student to student, students to teachers. I really do think some of the best training comes from students. And then in the center of this, you'll see the big magic word, school readiness. I really do think it's important that we're paying attention to school readiness. Some schools are just not ready for this stuff. Maybe they've had too many principals in a short amount of time. They've had some upheavals. They've had some district problems. You're not ready for this big change unless you've worked out that stuff first. And so that can be part of your implementation. But you need to do the school readiness surveys, the relationship surveys, to find out whether or not your school is ready for these big changes. I'm going to sort of skip what we did here in Hartford. I'm going to sort of jump this. I'm going to sort of jump this to here and leave this for some questions too. So in December, my book, Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School, will be released. It was written with the unbelievable guidance and editorial support of Margaret Thorsborn, who, if you don't know, in the restorative justice world, Mark Thorsborn is just a powerhouse of information and talent. And this book, although this doesn't show it, also has a foreword written by Judy Atkinson, an Aborigine woman from Australia who is an expert on Indigenous healing of trauma, and who who wrote probably, I will just tell you this, when I read the foreword for the first time after she'd written it, I cried. I was like so moved by her words. And so I'm really hoping this book like helps people do this work. Well, with that said, I'm just gonna sort of kill this wonderful PowerPoint, which has lots of stuff I didn't get to.